Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host, Michael Howard, the head of marketing at InfoTools. Today, we're joined by Paul Neto, the co-founder and CMO of Measure Protocol. He co-founded Measure to solve the challenges he saw in the digital data collection space, developing innovative technologies and fundamentals that offer new opportunities for data and analytics. Paul believes that by changing the fundamental principles of data collection with better access to valuable behavioral data, both brands and individuals can benefit. Amongst other things, today Paul's going to share the latest insights that Measure's data collection solution, Retro, has uncovered about how people are spending time engaging with apps on their mobile devices, amongst other things. It's going to be interesting to hear some of that, particularly with our behaviors that have changed over the last couple of years. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here and chatting today.
Yes. So what's the most significant things you're going to tell us today, Paul?
I think one of the things to start at is really how over the past, I'd say 2 decades, the industry has held a lot of promise around behavioral data. And I think the reality is we haven't been able to fully realize it or, take benefit up to this time. And I think part of the result that we see is that a lot of companies have big gaps in their consumer data collection strategies. And this can be around a number of things. And, for one, we're starting to see changes in privacy legislation, that's introducing, challenges for collecting data. We have lockdown from some of the big players such as Google and Apple and how they think about consumer data and stances that they've taken. And there's just general consumer skepticism around, sharing data. And I think to add to some of that complexity, we're starting to see some of our traditional data techniques, such as using VPNs, IDFAs, fingerprinting, cookies, all that stuff is quickly becoming, obsolete. And particularly for behavioral data, it adds some new challenges. So it's really about, looking at new approaches to new forms of behavioral data and data access, particularly around some of these various platforms. And, maybe a couple of highlights out of our latest App Life, report. Some really interesting stuff about where and how people are spending their time on these devices.
Yes, it sounds really fascinating. Can't wait to dive in. But first, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how Measure came about?
Yeah, sure. So myself, I'm actually by training, I'm a geographer. And I started in, climatology, working with, climate models. It's all very data-based. And working, with geographic information systems and, satellite imagery and stuff. So I've always had this fascination around data quality, processing and, compiling data. And by happenstance, like most people in research, I believe, is I came across an early startup in early 2000s in, market research, and we were building tech. Before the survey monkeys and survey engines were actually a thing. And we ended up going through an acquisition by Comscore. And this was pre their IPO days. And, I got to spend some interesting time, really at the background of some of the early behavioral data collection, some of the, various challenges around that. And I've been fortunate working with a few other startups in, different capacities, building tools. And often I ended up in this situation where we're building tools and, panels and, consumer engagement. And I even had some time working in the corporate side on, like the Cantors and stuff of the world. So we found a number, throughout the history is there's been always these big challenges around, data collection and engaging with consumers. And there's some of these real pitfalls and challenges. And, part of our, motivation for Measure was to, look at addressing some of those. And in our very, very early days, we were doing some work in blockchain. The reality is, as that stuff, transactions are just too expensive when it comes to the side of the blockchain. But we do have some of the fundamentals in our technology. And the important thing is what you take out of it is things like transparency, data quality, understanding things such as, reputations and, user, experience. So we really believe that, you have to look at some of the basic fundamentals of how you operate as a company, as you operate with your technology, and trying to build an ecosystem where data sharing just happens. I do think one of the dark secrets of this industry is what data collection is really like and what it's like for a respondent. And we like to kind of glaze over this. It's very difficult, and you're often constrained by the history that the industry has. So it's like, let's reset how we think things should work and go from there. Because if you think about individuals, they really only want to know a few things. They want to know what their data is being used for. And, some will call this, transparency. Versus today, a lot of things are just hidden behind obscure words. And they want to have a good experience. And what respondents traditionally do not have is a good experience. The level of disqualifications and payments, and it's, the surveys, do they really work on mobile? We're still talking about that for some reason. So they want to get an experience and they want to be paid well. Like, there is this economic problem of how do you pay people and not having people wanting the game system. So there's some very, very interesting game theory that's happening where, individuals aren't being paid very well. They're not having good experiences. So they're doing everything they can to try to complete, say, a basic survey. Whereas on the other side, you're getting kind of poor quality because of this ecosystem, so you can't pay them more. And because there's a lot of gaming in the systems, you're not in a situation to do that. So the motivations of the two sides of the market generally, aren't in sync. So we set out to do this, and everything we do, every decision is based around, are we meeting these things? Are we communicating what we actually want to do with this data? Are we paying them well? And is it a good experience? And we find once you find that, magic zone with consumers, they actually want to share more data. They want to earn from it, and they need to feel comfortable. So we often talk about, privacy. Well, privacy is just about respect. Transparency is about building trust. So once you kind of have this trust relationship, all of a sudden, very interesting things happen. Like we're primarily app-based, and we've had hundreds of thousands of people download the app, and we actually disqualify people and ban people from the platform who aren't able to participate and abide by the rules. This is like, society has basic rules. Mm-hmm. But what we end up having is an extremely engaged, loyal base that they're willing to do, we can ask them, go take a picture of your favorite shoes in your closet, and they will do things. So everything is around task-based, around providing, transparency and paying them properly, and doing things like giving them royalties every time that the data is used. So really, it's really about trying to readdress how we collect data. And by doing that, it's giving us some really interesting access to new forms of, of data. So it's been a pretty wild and interesting ride so far.
Cool. Looking forward to getting into that in a little bit. So you mentioned earlier that companies have some big gaps in their consumer data collection strategies. Can you tell us a little about what these are and how they came about?
Yeah, so one of the primary ones is, what if we were to highlight to people that you're actually missing 1 billion people? In the work that you're doing, you're effectively not reaching 1 billion individuals. And this is individuals on iOS. These are the Apple devices. And, sure, you can send surveys to them. And, there is this question around, are surveys suitable, replacements for understanding behavior? Sure, you can report what you did yesterday, but do you really know what you spent on your phone 3 months ago or 6 months ago? So,
Or even what did you have for dinner last Wednesday?
Exactly. So, one of the big gaps is the representation of iOS users in the behavioral space. Usually when you're looking at behavioral data, there's this little asterisk that says, Android only. So, based off some of the methodologies we've built, we are able to get access to iOS data, which the market is just extremely, hungry for, is trying to understand that. And because the world has really become an app-based world, everything has some kind of app around it, and purchasing and transactions are moving to these devices. People are missing those types of, transactions. Prime example is like Netflix. What are the various channels where people purchase their subscription to Netflix? Well, you get it through Netflix, you do it through your TV provider, you do it through your app. So there is this blind spot of transactions that are happening on the device. And secondly is what's happening in these environments, in apps. What's really happening within the world of TikTok, which is absolutely fascinating. What TikTok has done to the landscape. So it really comes down to those things: is looking at behavioral data comprehensively for an individual. This includes getting access to iOS, getting access to purchases, and also what's happening inside of various apps. And brands and media agencies are finding tremendous interest in trying to fill some of these gaps with this type of data.
Cool. So a little birdie told me that one of the solutions that you developed at Measure, Retro, just won an MRS ASC award for Best Technology Innovation. Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's all right. So this is actually the second time, I believe, that Measure's won this international award. Can you tell us about this award-winning tech?
Yes, it was extremely exciting for us, to get, industry, validation and recognition of the work that we're doing. And, Retro is one of our approaches to collecting behavioral data. Now, again, this is within the premise that we want to be transparent. We want to have a good experience, and we want to pay individuals, properly. And, part of the approach is if, for example, if I ask you what were your purchases, for 2022 in Amazon, could you give that to me in detail? And we take this approach where we say, show me, don't tell me. And our system is task-based. So, we send out tasks to do various different things. And, this one in particular is we say, we're interested in your Amazon purchase data, and we want to aggregate it across, users to understand, purchasing trends. So on their phone, we have some screen detection technology. All they do is they open up their Amazon app, they go to their history, and they scroll through it as fast as they can. So, and what the screen detection does is it parses out all the interesting data, and then we compile that across, thousands of individuals. So you get the date, you get the item, the price, all those things. And a task like this will take, 2 minutes. and they'll get paid anywhere from 50 cents to $3, depending on the complexity of the task. So, in terms of transparency, individuals see exactly what they're sharing. There's no VPNs, there's nothing that's kind of being, hidden in the background and, sniffing and stuff. So we're very open in what we're doing with it. And it uses some simple, yet sophisticated screen detection technology to be able to kind of parse that data. Now, every time it's actually being used, so if we have another client comes along that needs this data, we will also pay them a royalty. So all this is done within our MSR app that's on Android and iOS. It has a wallet. It's like a task-based, feed that they get. And also we do, because of this kind of sequence, one of the benefits we immediately get is longitudinal data. So, there's tasks that happen every Monday morning and people are waiting for it. And then if you complete all the ones for the month, guess what? You get a $3 bonus. So what ends up happening if you have a lot of data density and you have it, longitudinal. The opportunity with that is the overall quality of the data is much higher. And we have a reliable source. We're able to now get some iOS data. The reality is there's much more value in the marketplace for that. So this data that we've collected is used using Retro was the basis of our app life report, which is really just showcasing some just the top of the trees of some of the various data pieces that we collect. One of the tasks is around device usage and app usage. So we're able to get them to share the time that they've spent on apps, to the day, to the minute, and to even things like pickups and and notifications. So around the world of apps and mobile engagement and stuff, a lot of the metrics that you see today is really around downloads and attrition rates and stuff. Well, to us, we feel engagement is much more important than downloads. So we're able to kind of focus on actual usage and starting to trend usage, as new apps come in and other ones go out, and what's the first app that you use when you pick up your phone. So these are much stronger indicators of engagement than say just downloads.
No, sounds really fascinating. I can understand why you picked up the gongs for it. So what was some of the most surprising things you found about how people are using and spending time on their phones?
Yeah, so looking at some of the different age groups, we see some where they're spending over 40 hours a week. 40 hours a week on their device. Now, if anybody has a teenager, they know it's at least that. But even the 26 plus age groups, the number of hours are just incredible numbers that we kind of take for granted. But this is also showing the maturity of these devices, that they're not just media devices, they're not just email. There's a lot of utility, productivity. So we're seeing the amount of time, but also with that is, despite we hearing about all these millions of downloads, the average individual only uses about 40 per week. 40 core apps. Now, what's also interesting about the number of apps is, while it's about 40 a week, if you expand that to a month, it's actually closer to 90. And so this starts to indicate that there's a small number of apps that are core to an individual, and there's a lot of variability on as you start to move out from those those cores. So it's a very fragmented world, and downloads are kind of things like that really tend to be vanity metrics, and the truth comes through engagements. I'd say that's one of the big things. One of the other ones is when we're starting to look at TikTok, is those 16 to 25 are spending about 12 hours 12 hours a week on this particular app. The next closest one is YouTube, which is just under 6 hours. So there is a clear engagement pattern when it comes to TikTok, and it's completely changing the landscape. And this is incredibly important for, I think, a very particular reason. If for a long time, the discussion around media consumption had to do with spending more time with media. Since the advent of the television, people's time spending with media was increasing. It was increasing more and more. And then all of a sudden, we got these devices, and then we have an iPad, and we were consistently seeing time being spent with media increasing. But what's been happening now is we've now hit a ceiling. We've hit a threshold where if you're spending 40 hours a week on your phones, now most of this is media, there really isn't another 5 hours to be had. People are kind of maxing out on the level of engagement that they're having with devices and medium. So what this means is that for you to grow, you need to take it out from somewhere else. So the competitive landscape becomes much more important than it ever had. The idea of prime time, does that even exist anymore? Prime time is now defined not by a time block that we have advertising in certain types of shows. It's defined at the individual level. For a teenager, prime time is probably between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m.
I'd almost say that it's the first 5 seconds that's prime time now, that window where you can capture people or get them off to another app or post.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So it's we're starting to see some of these patterns, and even things like Discord. Discord is one of the heaviest apps used in terms of notifications. Like, there's so many controls for individuals today to suppress like noise and notifications. So whatever apps are coming through with notifications is an indication of choices that individual has made, and things like Discord are leading the numbers of those. And I think one of the other interesting things is this concept of gaming. Who's a gamer now? There's these traditional ideas of it's some teenage boy in his basement playing his Xbox and stuff, but the world of gaming and women involved in gaming, like, they spend more time on things like Roblox than men do. And who's a gamer today? Often people say, well, I'm not a gamer. It's like, well, I don't know, did you do Wordle trying to get it done just before midnight? Do you play Candy Crush? Do you play card games with people? Yes, that is a gamer. And it's really kind of across the board that the amount of gaming that's happening across all various demos.
Oh, well, I mean, you think about 40 hours a week. That's a working week for the typical person. Are we any better off for that?
Yeah, it's tough to say. I do know that we have a lot more water cooler type discussions to be had based off of what we've seen. Like today, we used to say, I read the other day. Well, what people mean today is I saw on TikTok, something. So that's ends up being a lot of discussion. So are we better off? I think the verdict is out for that. We're only going to be in a position once we can look back and see what the key benefits are. I think with everything, there's a little bit of both. My father, who grew up in a world without devices, I think the most used app now is FaceTime, and he's able to communicate with his grandkids. And there's certain things that are impossible, but it is a time sink.
Yeah, no, that's right. So why is this type of data so important for businesses to incorporate into their data strategies?
Well, I think one of the reasons, if we look at the research world, is we've overburdened surveys to be a proxy for behavioral data, and it's clear that just asking people what they did, what they bought, how much time they spend, just isn't viable for accurate data. And the world has become an app world. It's become a mobile world. The desktop to laptop to iPad to phone, all that stuff is very blurred, and increasingly the technology bounces between them, pretty seamlessly. So, because we are kind of maxed out in time, I think everything comes down to engagement. And as you start seeing, companies develop their apps and starting to develop their, the branding strategies, these platforms and, this type of engagement becomes even more important. And we talk about an omni world, we talk about individuals and all the encompassing data. This place, these app engagement and mobile engagement has been largely a black hole in the behavioral world. So this becomes increasingly more important to have some visibility into it. You just can't ignore it anymore.
No, sure. So one thing I want to just revisit,
Sure.
You're talking about VPNs, IDFAs, fingerprinting, browser cookies becoming obsolete. What does all of that mean for the market researcher? And how is that impacting what we're doing as an industry?
Yeah, so if you think about a lot of the behavioral data collection that's been done up until this point, to get access to that has been largely through VPNs, where you get somebody to install something, it monitors all the traffic. It's a lot of heavy lifting to do that. It makes it, and with the stance that Apple and privacy and all that has taken, that's becoming obsolete. So these options, aren't readily available like they used to be. It's become increasingly expensive, not only to conduct, because to get somebody to install something like this and keep it on their device becomes, quite difficult. And it's, increasingly difficult to process this data. And, if you think about some of the cookie tracking that's being done, that's going away, the availability of behavioral data is just becoming that much more difficult for researchers. And I think the job of researchers, it's the complexity that's been changing over time. All at one point, you had to be proficient in survey design and everything. Well, now we need to be proficient in data collection methodologies. We have to be proficient in understanding cookies and matching and targeting. It becomes complex. Then we need to be even now looking at behavioral data and how do we process and understand this type of data. So it becomes extremely difficult for the researcher. And one of the benefits of a survey, which is also its downside, is that it's simple to implement. But for collecting behavioral data, self-reported behavioral data, we're just overburdening our surveys. It's a poor experience for individuals, and it's questionable data quality that comes out of it. So when it comes to behaviors, media consumption, everything is so fragmented. It's a real challenge for the industry to bring all those pieces together.
Sure. So quite curious, the think, say, do gap. So what people think is different to what people say is different to what people do. Have you seen any studies that have brought measure protocol together with some of those think and say?
Yeah, so we've done some work in that area, and in particular around in-app transactions, because what becomes interesting there is people are signing up to subscriptions all the time. And they're buying coins for their games. And, you can now buy coins in TikTok to then reward creators and stuff. So we would ask people, what do you think you spent in this past month in your in-app transactions? And we got them to share the behavioral data. And I think it was something like 230, 240% that they were wrong. They were wrong by that much. Wow. 2 to 3 times that they were either underestimating or overestimating. There just was not, the percentage that we're getting it right was such a small number, even within $10. And it goes to show the type of, it's the technology makes things so easy that we just can't process it the way that we used to. We used to have a bank book that got printed into, then we got a Visa bill that was itemized a month, and now it's all kind of online, and now we just kind of tap, subscribe, and go. So, the data that we've seen is people just can't, collate that type of information in their, in their mind. So it's just fascinating.
Yeah, wow. So if I can recap what we've talked about, Paul, you mentioned some of the really interesting things that you and the team at Measure Protocol are doing in the market research and insight space, particularly around that behavioral side of things. You introduced us to Retro, which recently picked up an award with MRS. You highlighted how most companies have big data gaps in their consumer data collection strategies, and gave some background as to why this has happened. Some of which included the inability to collect certain data due to things like privacy legislation, the big lockdowns at the big lockdowns at the big tech players like Google and Apple have been instigating, and then also that element of general consumer skepticism on sharing data as well. You reminded us how some of the existing practices in our traditional data collection methodologies, such as VPNs, IDFAs, fingerprinting, and browser cookies, will soon be, if aren't already, obsolete. So some added challenges there from what we do as market researchers. We also talked about how some new approaches that provide access to new forms of behavioral data across once inaccessible platforms in a low friction, cost effective manner can or are rising in popularity. You shared some results on the recent survey app life report that rounds up some of this data. We heard some of those surprising factors. 40%, was it 40 hours a week spent on our devices, 12 hours a week on TikTok, and YouTube and Instagram also following those up. And then lastly, we discussed what some of the findings may mean for businesses and market research teams. So thanks very much for joining us on the show, Paul. Any final remarks on what we've talked about today?
No, just a big thank you for having us on the program. It's we always love to chat about this stuff. So always open for a discussion at any point.
Yeah, nice. Looking forward to seeing what comes out of Measure in the years to come. So we'll be following that one. So yes, thank you so much. A big thank you to everyone else also for tuning in to today's episode. For the listeners out there, if you have liked what you've heard, feel free to reach out to Paul and the team at Measure Protocol. Subscribe to the podcast, share it with others, or leave a review as well. Would be really appreciative of that. So thank you for listening to Now That's Significant.